They thought they were eating the world's rarest delicacy, but the meat was still dreaming, and it was looking for a new place to wake up. The ocean is not a garden, it is a graveyard that forgot to die. My brother, Silas, lived by this rule. He was a black trawler, a ghost in the shipping lanes who hunted the depths where the light of the sun is a forgotten myth. 3 weeks ago, he returned from a nameless trench in the South Pacific with a catch that should have stayed buried. He called it the Pale King. It was a fish, or at least it had been once. It was 6 feet of translucent, gelatinous flesh, featuring rows of unnervingly human-like molars and a hide covered in pulsating, oily black veins that twitched long after the creature's heart had stopped. Silas didn't see a monster, he saw a payday. He sold the Pale King to the Abyssal Table, an ultra-exclusive private kitchen that catered to the city's elite, people with too much money and an appetite for the forbidden. I remember the smell when he carved the first slab in our kitchen. It didn't smell like sea salt, it smelled like old copper and wet earth. It's the cleanest protein on earth, Silas boasted, his eyes bloodshot and wide. He had already tasted it. The night of the grand feast, 12 guests gathered in a hidden cellar. They ate the meat raw, thinly sliced until it was as transparent as glass. They described the flavor as divine, a taste that felt like a memory of home. But as they ate, the black veins in the meat didn't dissolve. They migrated. I watched Silas that night. He was shaking, his skin turning a sickly, bruised shade of gray. He kept drinking water, gallon after gallon, but his throat remained parched. "It's dry, Elias," he whispered, his voice sounding like gravel rubbing together. "The world is so dry." That was the night the first guest walked into the harbor and didn't come back up. They found him the next morning, but he hadn't drowned. His lungs weren't full of water, they were full of the same black, pulsating oil found in the fish. The hunger begins in the marrow, but it ends in the lungs, turning every breath of air into a localized hell of invisible water. By the 3rd day, the dry drowning epidemic began. It started with the guests of the feast. They didn't fall ill with fever or cough, they simply stopped being able to process oxygen from the air. I found Silas in the bathroom, the shower running cold. He was hunched over the tub, his mouth open so wide I heard his jaw hinge crack. He was gasping, his chest heaving with such violence that his ribs were visibly bruising the skin from the inside. "I can't find it," he wheezed. To the infected, the air had become a vacuum. They felt as though they were sinking 10,000 feet below the surface. The panic was infectious. I watched through the window as our neighbor, a woman who had attended the feast, ran onto her lawn and began clawing at her own throat. She wasn't trying to breathe, she was trying to open a hole. She took a kitchen knife and, with a horrific, wet precision, carved a slit between her ribs. She didn't scream. Instead, she let out a long, bubbling sigh of relief as a thick, black fluid, the same oily substance from the fish, began to leak out. The city's drainage system began to fail. Not because of rain, but because the infected were congregating at the sewers. They were drawn to the damp, the dark, and the cold. I saw a group of them huddled around a fire hydrant they had smashed open. They weren't drinking the water, they were trying to shove it into their ears and noses. Their bodies were changing. Their skin was becoming translucent and slimy, and their eyes were migrating to the sides of their heads. The Pale King wasn't just a fish, it was a blueprint. It was rewriting their DNA, turning the citizens of a modern metropolis into the inhabitants of a prehistoric trench. The worst part isn't the transformation, it's the realization that your consciousness is being pushed into a corner to make room for something older than the stars. Silas was the first to show the black eggs. He had stopped speaking entirely, his tongue having swollen into a black, muscular mass that occupied his entire oral cavity. He sat in the living room, his shirt off, and I could see them, dozens of hard, marble-sized lumps moving beneath his skin. They moved with a rhythmic, pulsing intelligence, migrating from his limbs toward his spine. I tried to call the hospital, but the phone lines were dead, replaced by a rhythmic, wet clicking sound, the sound of the entity communicating through the copper wires. The city was falling silent. The only sound was the constant, heavy thumping of the infected as they threw themselves against the walls of their houses, trying to crack their shells. I watched as Silas's back began to split. It wasn't a wound, it was a deliberate opening. The skin peeled back like a ripened fruit, revealing his spine. But his vertebrae weren't bone anymore. They had been replaced by a series of interlocking, obsidian-colored scales. The lumps, the eggs, began to hatch. Tiny, needle-like protrusions poked through his skin, venting a freezing cold mist that smelled of the abyss. Silas looked at me, and for a second, I saw my brother. He was weeping, but the tears were black and thick. "It's so cold," his eyes seemed to say. Then, the molars, the human molars from the fish, began to erupt from his chest. The parasite wasn't just living in him, it was building a cathedral out of his bones. When the city's heart stops beating, the pipes will start, and you will realize that the water was never on your side. The infection reached the reservoir. It didn't need the meat anymore, the black oil was now in the water supply. I watched from the roof as the city transformed into a living organism. People were no longer individuals, they were nodes in a massive, aquatic network. They stood on their balconies, swaying in unison as if caught in a deep-sea current that only they could feel. I heard a sound coming from the pipes in the walls, a heavy, resonant thump-thump. It was the sound of a heart the size of a skyscraper. The collective pulse of the city was now synced to the entity beneath the harbor. The sewers were no longer carrying waste, they were acting as veins, transporting the black ichor and the hatchlings to every corner of the grid. I found a survivor in the hallway, a young man who had locked himself in a closet with a bottle of distilled water. He was shivering, holding a radio that played nothing but static. "They're talking," he whispered. "The ones in the pipes. They're saying the surface is too bright. They're going to pull the city down." He was right. The buildings were starting to lean. The foundation of the city, built on reclaimed land and old silt, was being hollowed out by the infected, who were digging tunnels toward the sea. They were creating a new trench, right beneath our feet. The ground felt soft, like the belly of a whale. The last thing you hear isn't a scream, it's the sound of the ocean finally claiming its long-lost property. Silas is no longer my brother. He is a pillar of black coral and translucent flesh, anchored to the floor of our kitchen. His ribs have fanned out into a set of massive, skeletal gills that filter the stagnant air. He doesn't move, but he watches me with a dozen eyes that have opened along his arms. The city is gone. A massive sinkhole has opened in the center of the business district, swallowing the skyscrapers into the rising tide of the black oil. The sky is a bruised purple, and the air is thick with the scent of brine and rot. I am the only one left who hasn't tasted the water. My throat is a desert, my tongue is a piece of dry leather, but I know the moment I drink, I am lost. I can hear them now. Thousands of voices, muffled by the water, calling my name from the kitchen sink. They aren't angry. They are inviting. They tell me about the peace of the depths, where the light can't hurt you and the weight of the world is a warm embrace. I look at Silas, the thing that was Silas, and I see him twitch. He is waiting for me to join the feast. The Pale King has won. The ocean has come to the city, not as a flood, but as a predator that walked through the front door and sat down at our table. I pick up a glass of water, the liquid shimmering with a faint, oily light, and I realize, the world isn't ending. It's just going back to the dark where it started.